The calls that went unanswered. The last time all three of us sat around the same dinner table, my house was full of laughter. My son Daniel argued about baseball with his younger sister, Emily. My wife, Margaret, rolled her eyes and kept serving food as if she had done it 1,000 times before. I watched them from the end of the table, thinking I was the richest man alive. Not because I had money. Because I had a family. If someone had told me that one day those same children would tell me, "Stop calling us. We have our own lives. Stay on your own," I would have laughed. I would have said they were talking about someone else's children. Not mine. I spent 38 years working as a civil engineer. There were birthdays I missed because of construction deadlines. There were vacations I canceled because overtime paid for piano lessons, college tuition, and family medical bills. Every dollar I earned had a destination before it even reached my bank account. Daniel dreamed of becoming a corporate lawyer. Emily wanted to study medicine. Neither dream came cheap. When the tuition bills arrived, Margaret and I sold our vacation cabin without telling the kids. When Daniel needed money for law school, I refinanced the house. When Emily's medical program required expensive equipment, Margaret quietly sold the jewelry her mother had left her. We never called them sacrifices. We called them parenting. Years passed. The children graduated. Daniel landed a high-paying job in Chicago. Emily became a respected pediatric surgeon in Seattle. Margaret looked at me one evening and smiled. We did it. I squeezed her hand. Now it's our turn. We talked about traveling. Italy, Ireland, maybe even Alaska. For the first time in decades, our lives finally belonged to us. Then everything changed. Margaret was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors tried. She tried even harder. For 18 months, she fought with a courage I still cannot describe. Daniel visited twice. Emily came 3 times. They always had reasons to leave early. Important meetings, hospital schedules, flights they couldn't miss. Margaret never complained. They're building their futures, she whispered whenever I looked disappointed. They love us. I wanted to believe her. The night she passed away, she held my hand. Promise me something, anything. Don't spend the rest of your life alone. I promised. I had every intention of keeping it. For the first year after the funeral, I called my children every Sunday. Sometimes Daniel answered. Sometimes he texted. Sometimes the phone rang until voicemail. Emily usually replied days later. Busy week. Talk soon. Love you. At first, I understood. They had careers, responsibilities, families. Then Sundays became once a month. Once a month became birthdays. Birthdays became holidays. Eventually, I stopped expecting anyone to answer. My 72nd birthday arrived on a rainy Thursday. I cooked myself a small steak. Bought my own cake. Lit one candle. The phone stayed silent. At nearly 10 o'clock that night, it finally buzzed. A text from Daniel. Happy birthday, Dad. Sorry, crazy day. Emily sent a message the next morning. Hope you had a wonderful birthday. No phone call. No visit. No video chat. Just 12 words. I stared around the empty dining room. The silence felt heavier than ever. Months later, I slipped while cleaning the driveway after a snowstorm. Nothing serious. Just a fractured wrist. My neighbor, Frank, drove me to the emergency room. When the nurse asked for an emergency contact, I hesitated. Daniel. No answer. Emily. Straight to voicemail. Frank gently placed a hand on my shoulder. You can put my number. That hurt more than the broken bone. Because strangers shouldn't have to replace your own children. After that day, I stopped making excuses. I still loved them, but love couldn't erase reality. Reality was simple. My children had moved on. And somewhere along the way, they had left me behind. One afternoon, I decided to surprise Daniel. I booked a flight to Chicago. I imagined taking him to lunch. Talking about old times. Maybe meeting my grandchildren. When I arrived at his office, the receptionist smiled politely. I'm sorry, sir. Mr. Carter is unavailable. I don't mind waiting. She made a phone call. Minutes later she returned. I'm afraid today isn't a good day. As I stood to leave, I accidentally overheard Daniel's voice behind a nearby office door. Tell him I'm in a meeting. I froze. He wasn't busy. He simply didn't want to see me. I walked back to the airport carrying the small gift I'd bought for my grandson. The wrapping paper stayed perfectly smooth. It was never opened. A month later, I called Emily. She answered after several rings. Dad, can this wait? I just wanted to hear your voice. I'm preparing for surgery. I understand. I'll call you later. She didn't. 3 weeks passed. No call, no message, no apology. That evening I sat on the back porch watching the sunset Margaret used to love. I could almost hear her voice. They're good kids. Maybe they were. Maybe life had simply convinced them that parents could wait forever. But parents grow old. Loneliness grows faster. The following Sunday, I called both of them again. Neither answered. An hour later, Daniel finally called back. His voice sounded impatient. "Dad, why do you keep calling?" I remained quiet. "I just wanted to check in." "You don't have to keep checking in. Emily and I have our own lives." His words struck harder than any punch. "I know. So, please stop calling all the time. Live your own life. Stay on your own." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stared at the silent phone. Then I looked around the large house Margaret and I had built together. For the first time, it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a place where memories lived. And where I no longer mattered. I walked slowly into my study. Opened an old wooden drawer. Inside was a business card I hadn't touched in years. It belonged to the attorney who had helped Margaret and me write our wills. I picked it up, read the name twice. Then I reached for the telephone. "Good afternoon," the receptionist answered. "Law offices of Michael Reynolds." I took a slow breath. "My name is Thomas Carter. I think it's time to update my estate plan." Thomas Carter sat quietly with the phone in his hand after scheduling the appointment. For several minutes, he didn't move. The silence in the house no longer felt painful. It felt clear. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for his children to call. He wasn't hoping for a visit. He was making a decision for himself. The following Tuesday, Thomas walked into attorney Michael Reynolds' office carrying a worn leather folder. Michael stood and shook his hand warmly. "Thomas, it's been years. I wish we were meeting under happier circumstances." "So do I." After a few minutes of conversation, Michael leaned forward. "What would you like to change?" Thomas took a deep breath. "My children no longer want me in their lives." Michael remained silent. "I've spent years pretending everything was fine. It isn't." He slid several documents across the desk. "The house is fully paid for. My retirement accounts are healthy. I own investment properties. I've saved enough to live comfortably." Michael looked up. "Are you certain?" Thomas nodded. "I don't want revenge. I simply want my life's work to go where it will actually matter." For the next 3 hours, they reviewed every asset, every account, every investment. Thomas created a new living trust. Instead of leaving everything automatically to Daniel and Emily, the trust included strict conditions. If they wished to inherit anything, they would first have to rebuild a genuine relationship, not with gifts or money, but through consistent care, honesty, and time. If they chose not to, much of the estate would instead fund scholarships, children's hospitals, and charities Margaret had always supported. When the final page was signed, Michael closed the folder. "Many parents make decisions out of anger. You didn't." Thomas smiled faintly. "I'm making this decision out of peace." Life slowly began to change. Thomas joined a local reading club. He volunteered twice a week at the community center. He began mentoring engineering students at a nearby college. For the first time since Margaret's death, his calendar was full. Not with obligations, with purpose. He laughed again. He made friends. He even started traveling on short weekend trips. Meanwhile, months passed without a single call from Daniel or Emily. Then, just before Christmas, Daniel called. His cheerful tone surprised Thomas. "Hi, Dad." Thomas smiled sadly. "Hello, Daniel. How've you been?" "I'm well." There was an awkward pause. Then Daniel finally reached the real reason for the call. "So, I heard your neighborhood has become really valuable." Thomas quietly looked out the window. "It has. I was thinking, maybe it's time to sell the place." Thomas said nothing. "You know, that house is way too big for one person." Still silence. "We could help you move." "We." Emily agrees. Thomas understood immediately. Neither child had asked how he was. Neither asked about his health. They wanted the house. "I appreciate your concern," Thomas replied calmly. "But I've already made arrangements." "What arrangements?" "You'll find out when the time is appropriate." Daniel sounded confused. "What does that mean?" "It means exactly what I said." Thomas politely ended the call. Across the country, Daniel phoned Emily. "Something's different." "What happened?" He sounded confident. Emily frowned. "Maybe someone's influencing him." "You think?" "I don't know. But we should visit." For the first time in nearly 2 years, the siblings agreed to see their father. Not because they missed him. Because they sensed something had changed. Neither of them realized they were already far too late. Thomas Carter no longer counted the days by missed phone calls. He counted them by sunrises. Every morning began the same way: a cup of coffee on the back porch, a walk through the neighborhood, and a quiet conversation with himself about how far he had come. The pain hadn't disappeared, it had simply stopped controlling him. His neighbors noticed the difference. The lonely widower who rarely left the house had become one of the friendliest people on the street. He volunteered at the local library, helped engineering students prepare for interviews, and spent Saturday mornings repairing bicycles for children whose families couldn't afford new ones. Margaret would have been proud. One afternoon, attorney Michael Reynolds stopped by for coffee. "You look different," Michael said with a smile. "I feel different. Any regrets?" Thomas looked around the home he and Margaret had built together. "Only one." "What is it?" "I wasted years waiting for people who had already walked away." Michael nodded. "The trust documents are finalized. And the charities, they've accepted the future endowment." Thomas smiled. "Good." Meanwhile, Daniel and Emily were having a very different conversation. "I checked public property records," Daniel said. "The house is still in Dad's name." Emily folded her arms. "So why is he acting like everything's already settled?" "I don't know, but I have a feeling he changed something." Neither of them admitted what they were really worried about. It wasn't losing their father. It was losing their inheritance. The following weekend, Thomas hosted a barbecue. Not for relatives, for neighbors, friends, volunteers, and former students. More than 30 people came. The backyard echoed with laughter for the first time since Margaret had passed away. As Thomas looked around, he realized something. Family wasn't always defined by blood. Sometimes it was built through kindness, loyalty, and shared moments. That evening, one of his neighbors asked quietly, "Do your children ever visit?" Thomas smiled gently. "They're busy living their lives." It was the kindest answer he could give. A month later, Thomas hired a professional home management company. They upgraded the property's security system, installed cameras, and arranged private security for the gated entrance whenever requested. It wasn't because he feared strangers. It was because Michael had advised him to prepare for unexpected family conflicts once the estate changes became known. Thomas agreed, not out of anger, out of wisdom. Spring arrived. Nearly 9 months had passed without a single visit from Daniel or Emily. Then, unexpectedly, both called on the same day. "Hi, Dad," Emily said warmly. "I was thinking maybe we should spend some time together." Thomas smiled to himself. "What changed? What do you mean? You've been too busy for almost 2 years." Silence. Then she laughed nervously. "We've just missed you." Thomas had waited years to hear those words. Now they sounded rehearsed. "I hope that's true," he replied. A week later, Daniel suggested a family reunion at the old house. Thomas agreed. "Come next Saturday." Neither child knew that Michael Reynolds would also be there. Nor did they know that security staff had already been instructed exactly what to do if the meeting turned hostile. As Saturday approached, Thomas stood in Margaret's garden. He looked at her favorite roses and whispered, "I kept my promise. I didn't spend the rest of my life alone." He smiled. "I just had to discover that peace begins when expectations end." The next morning, 2 luxury SUVs turned onto his street. Daniel and Emily had finally come home. But what awaited them behind the gates would change everything. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze. Thomas Carter was already awake before sunrise. He watered Margaret's roses, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and sat quietly on the porch. Unlike the anxious man he had once been, he felt no fear about what the day might bring. At exactly 10 o'clock, 2 black SUVs turned onto the street. Daniel stepped out of the first vehicle wearing an expensive tailored suit. Emily emerged from the second, carrying a neatly wrapped gift bag. Neither had visited in almost 2 years. Now they smiled as though nothing had happened. As they approached the front gate, a uniformed security officer stepped forward. "Good morning. We're here to see our father," Daniel said confidently. "Your names, please." After checking a tablet, the guard nodded politely. "Mr. Carter has authorized your entry to the front garden only. Please wait here." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean, front garden? This is our family home." The guard remained calm. "Sir, these are my instructions." Minutes later, Thomas walked toward them. He looked healthy, confident, and relaxed. For a brief moment, Daniel barely recognized his father. "Dad," Emily said, stepping forward as if to hug him. Thomas smiled politely. "It's good to see you both." The hug never happened. An awkward silence settled between them. Emily handed him the gift bag. "We brought you something." Thomas accepted it, graciously. Thank you. No one mentioned the missed birthdays, the unanswered calls, the empty holidays. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. Dad, we think it's time to discuss the future. Thomas raised an eyebrow. The future? You shouldn't be managing such a large estate alone. Emily quickly added, we're only worried about you. Thomas looked at both of them for a long moment. Are you? Neither answered. Instead, Daniel glanced toward the house. I noticed you've upgraded security. Yes. That seems unnecessary. Thomas smiled gently. I've learned that preparation is never unnecessary. Just then, another car pulled into the driveway. Attorney Michael Reynolds stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. Daniel exchanged a confused look with Emily. Dad, why is your lawyer here? Because today's conversation requires legal clarity. Michael greeted everyone politely before opening his briefcase. There are documents Mr. Carter has asked me to explain. Daniel's expression changed instantly. What documents? The updated estate plan. Emily forced a smile. We don't need lawyers. We're family. Thomas answered quietly. Family speaks to one another. The words landed like a stone. Michael continued. Several months ago, Mr. Carter legally transferred portions of his estate into a trust. Daniel interrupted. You changed your will. I updated my plans, Thomas replied calmly. For years, I planned to leave everything equally to both of you. He paused. But plans change when relationships change. Emily's voice trembled. So, what does that mean? It means money is no longer automatic. Michael explained that significant portions of the estate would support scholarships, children's hospitals, community programs, and charities Margaret had loved. The remaining inheritance was subject to conditions that valued genuine care, honesty, and a restored relationship rather than entitlement. Daniel's face turned red. You can't be serious. I am. You owe us that inheritance. Thomas looked directly into his son's eyes. I owed you love. I gave you love. I owed you an education. I gave you one. I owed you every opportunity I could provide. I gave you those too. But I never owed you the rewards of my lifetime without respect. Silence. Emily lowered her head. Daniel took an angry step toward the house. I'm going inside. Before he reached the front door, two security officers calmly stepped into his path. Sir, you don't have permission to enter. Daniel stared in disbelief. This is my father's house. One officer replied professionally. It is Mr. Carter's private property, and we're following his instructions. For the first time in his life, Daniel realized something painful. The house had never been his. It had always belonged to the man he had taken for granted. Thomas sighed softly. I never wanted this day. I wanted family dinners. I wanted phone calls. I wanted grandchildren running through this yard. You chose distance. I chose peace. Emily's eyes filled with tears. Daniel stood speechless. The confidence they had arrived with was gone. For the first time in years, they understood that what they had lost wasn't just an inheritance. They had lost their father's trust. No one spoke for several seconds. The quiet in the front garden felt heavier than any argument. Daniel stared at the ground. Emily wiped away a tear. Thomas looked at both of them, not with anger, but with sadness. I never wanted this meeting to be about money, he said softly. I wanted it to be about family. Emily finally found her voice. Dad, we made mistakes. Thomas nodded. Yes, you did. Daniel clenched his fists. We were busy building our careers. I know. We thought you'd always be there. Thomas smiled. Sadly, that's the mistake many people make. They believe parents will wait forever. But time doesn't wait for anyone. Attorney Michael Reynolds quietly closed his briefcase. My work here is finished, he said. Before leaving, he shook Thomas's hand and nodded respectfully to the family. The garden became silent once again. Emily stepped closer. I've replayed our last phone call so many times. When you called, I really was preparing for surgery. Thomas nodded. I believed you. But after that, you never called back. Emily lowered her head. I know. I kept thinking I'd call tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week, then next month, and eventually, I was ashamed. Thomas answered gently. Shame grows in silence. Daniel looked toward the old oak tree where he and Emily had played as children. I remember building a treehouse there. Thomas smiled. You fell out twice. Daniel laughed through tears. You still caught me. I always tried. Those words broke something inside him. He realized his father had spent a lifetime catching him whenever he fell. But when Thomas had fallen into loneliness, no one had been there to catch him. I can't change the past, Daniel admitted. No, but I want to change the future. Thomas studied his son's face. For the first time in years, he saw sincerity instead of confidence. Not certainty, hope. Emily reached into her purse and pulled out an old photograph. It showed the four of them standing on a beach decades earlier. Margaret was laughing. Thomas had his arm around both children. Emily held the picture carefully. Mom always said this was her favorite day. Thomas smiled. Mine too. They spent the next 3 hours talking. Not about money. Not about the estate. About memories. Margaret's terrible singing while cooking. Family camping trips. School plays. Christmas mornings. For the first time in years, they spoke like a family. When the sun began to set, Daniel stood. Dad, I don't expect forgiveness today. I don't expect anything. I just hope you'll give us the chance to earn back your trust. Thomas looked toward the roses Margaret had planted years before. Then he remembered the promise he had made beside her hospital bed. Don't spend the rest of your life alone. He had kept that promise. Not because his children returned. Because he had rebuilt a meaningful life. He turned back to them. I won't rewrite the trust. Not today. Daniel nodded. I understand, but I will give you something more valuable than money. Both children looked at him. A chance. But understand this. Trust grows slowly. It isn't inherited. It is earned. Emily embraced her father. This time, he returned the hug. Daniel joined them moments later. It wasn't a perfect ending. Years of neglect couldn't disappear in a single afternoon. But it was an honest beginning. Over the following months, Daniel and Emily kept their word. They called every Sunday, not because they wanted something, but because they wanted to know how their father was doing. They visited on birthdays. They celebrated holidays together. They brought Thomas's grandchildren, who quickly filled the old house with laughter. Thomas never mentioned the inheritance again. He watched their actions instead of listening to promises. 1 year later, Michael Reynolds visited once more. Have you made another decision? He asked. Thomas smiled. I have. Michael opened his notebook. The trust remains exactly as it is. But I'd like to add one letter. A letter, yes, a letter to my children. One they would read someday. It wasn't about money. It simply said, the greatest inheritance I could ever leave you was never this house, these investments, or my savings. It was the example of sacrifice, forgiveness, and unconditional love. If you truly understand that, you've already received everything I hope to give you. When Thomas signed the letter, he looked through the window. His grandchildren were chasing each other across the same backyard where Daniel and Emily had once played. Their laughter echoed through the air. Thomas closed his eyes and whispered, welcome home. Spring faded into summer, and for the first time in years, Thomas Carter's phone rang for reasons that had nothing to do with money. Every Sunday evening, almost exactly at 6 o'clock, Daniel called. Not to ask about the house. Not to discuss investments. Simply to ask, how was your week, Dad? The conversations were awkward at first. Years of silence cannot be erased by a few polite phone calls. Sometimes they spoke for only 5 minutes. Sometimes they ran out of things to say. But neither of them hung up first. That alone was progress. Emily kept her promise as well. She began visiting once every month, even if only for a weekend. She would cook breakfast in the same kitchen where Margaret had once prepared Sunday pancakes. The first time she reached for the old cast iron skillet, she stopped. Her fingers rested on its worn handle. I remember Mom making blueberry pancakes every Saturday. Thomas smiled. She always burned the first one. Emily laughed. I thought she did it on purpose. So did I. For a moment, it felt as though Margaret was still part of the conversation. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel arrived with his wife, Rachel, and their 2 children. 8-year-old Noah stepped out of the car holding a baseball glove. Dad says you used to be really good. Thomas chuckled. Your father exaggerates. No, Grandpa, Noah insisted. He said you hit a home run over the school fence. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. I may have told them a few stories. Thomas picked up another glove. Let's see if I remember how. Within minutes, the backyard echoed with laughter. Thomas's knees were older. His throws were slower. But every catch felt like a small piece of his heart being returned. Emily watched quietly from the porch. She whispered to herself, we almost took all of this away. That evening, after everyone had gone inside, Daniel remained in the garden. Dad, Thomas looked up from trimming Margaret's roses. I owe you an apology. You already apologized. Not completely. Daniel took a deep breath. When Mom died, I buried myself in work because I didn't know how to deal with losing her. I convinced myself success would make everything better. It didn't. I stopped answering your calls because every conversation reminded me that I had failed as a son. Thomas listened without interrupting. I wasn't angry with you. I was ashamed. Thomas placed the gardening shears on the bench. Pain explains our choices. It doesn't excuse them. Daniel nodded. I know, and I'm willing to spend however long it takes making things right. Thomas rested a hand on his son's shoulder. Then don't tell me. Show me. Daniel smiled. I will. The following month brought an unexpected challenge. Late one evening, Thomas felt a sharp pain in his chest while reading. His neighbor Frank immediately called an ambulance. This time, however, something was different. Before the ambulance reached the hospital, Daniel was already on his way from Chicago. Emily had cleared her operating schedule and boarded the first available flight. When Thomas opened his eyes the next morning, both children were sitting beside his bed. Emily stood first. You scared us. Thomas smiled weakly. I guess old men are allowed to do that once in a while. Daniel laughed through tired eyes. We're not leaving until you're home. For the first time since Margaret's passing, Thomas didn't face a hospital room alone. And deep inside, he realized something important. Perhaps this time, they truly meant it. Thomas Carter spent 3 days in the hospital. Fortunately, the doctors ruled out a major heart attack. It was a severe stress-related cardiac episode, combined with exhaustion and high blood pressure. They insisted he slow down, rest more, and avoid unnecessary stress. Daniel and Emily never left his side. One stayed during the day. The other stayed through the night. The nurses quietly assumed they had always been a close family. Only Thomas knew how much had changed in such a short time. When he was discharged, Daniel drove him home. As the car pulled into the driveway, Thomas noticed something unusual. His lawn had been mowed. The flower beds were freshly cleaned. Margaret's roses had been carefully watered. Who did this? He asked. Emily smiled. We did. You. Daniel nodded. We came a few days before your hospital stay. We wanted to surprise you. Thomas looked at the garden for a long moment. It wasn't the perfect landscaping that touched him. It was the effort. For years, they had believed money solved every problem. Now they were giving something far more valuable. Their time. A few weeks later, another surprise arrived. Daniel requested a week off from work. Emily rearranged her surgery schedule. Together they planned a family dinner in the old house. Not because it was Thanksgiving. Not because it was Christmas. Simply because they wanted to be together. As everyone gathered around the dining table, Noah looked at an old framed photograph hanging on the wall. Grandpa, who's she? Thomas smiled warmly. That's your grandmother, Margaret. She looks kind. The kindest person I've ever known. Emily quietly stood, walked to the kitchen, and returned with one of Margaret's handwritten recipe books. I found this while cleaning the pantry. The pages were worn and stained with years of family meals. Daniel carefully opened it. Inside the front cover, Margaret had written years earlier. No family stays together by accident. It takes patience, forgiveness, and choosing each other again and again. The room fell silent. Daniel closed the book and wiped away a tear. I wish I had read this years ago. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Thomas stepped onto the back porch. Daniel joined him. I've been thinking, Daniel said. About what? You changed your trust because you believed we'd forgotten what family meant. Thomas nodded. I did. You weren't wrong. Daniel looked toward the backyard where his own children had been playing only hours earlier. I don't want Noah and Lily to ever treat me the way I treated you. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. Then teach them while you still can. Daniel smiled. I will. The next morning, attorney Michael Reynolds called. Thomas, I need to meet with you. Is something wrong? Not exactly. I've received several inquiries about purchasing your property. Thomas laughed softly. People have wanted this land for years. The offers are much higher now. I've already made my decision. I thought you might say that. After ending the call, Thomas looked around the home once more. This house had witnessed birthdays, graduations, tears, heartbreak, forgiveness, and second chances. Its greatest value had never been measured in dollars. It was measured in memories. And for the first time in many years, those memories were no longer painful. They were alive again. Autumn arrived quietly. The maple trees lining Thomas Carter's street turned shades of gold and crimson, covering the sidewalks with leaves that reminded him of the years that had slipped by far too quickly. This time, however, he wasn't watching the seasons change. Alone. Every Sunday, the house came alive. Daniel arrived with Rachel, Noah, and Lily. Emily brought homemade desserts and insisted on helping in the kitchen. The dining table that had once collected dust was filled with laughter again. Sometimes they talked about work. Sometimes they remembered Margaret. Sometimes they simply enjoyed being together. Thomas noticed something important. No one mentioned the inheritance anymore. That silence meant more than any promise. One afternoon, Michael Reynolds stopped by with a sealed envelope. "I've brought the annual trust review." Thomas smiled. "Let's sit on the porch." After reviewing the documents, Michael looked up. "So, have you changed your mind?" Thomas gazed at the children playing in the backyard. "No, the trust stays exactly as it is." Michael nodded. "I thought so." Thomas continued, "But I'd like to add one final document." "What kind?" "A letter." Over the next hour, Thomas wrote carefully. Every word came from the heart. He didn't write about money. He didn't list his accomplishments. Instead, he wrote about lessons. He described the nights Margaret stayed awake caring for sick children, the overtime shifts that paid college tuition, the dreams they had willingly postponed so their children could chase bigger dreams. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "If you are reading this, it means my journey has ended. I hope you remember that love is not measured by gifts, money, or inheritance. It is measured by presence. The greatest gift you can give the people who love you is your time. Never wait until regret becomes your loudest memory." Michael folded the letter and placed it inside the trust file. "I'll make sure it's delivered when the time comes." Years passed. Thomas grew older, but he was no longer lonely. Daniel called every Sunday without fail. Emily visited whenever she could, sometimes bringing young doctors she mentored just to introduce them to the man whose advice had helped shape her life. The grandchildren adored their grandfather. Noah loved hearing stories about old construction projects. Lily spent hours learning how to bake Margaret's famous apple pie using the handwritten recipe book. The old house was alive again. Not because it had been renovated. Because the people inside it had changed. On Thomas's 80th birthday, the entire family gathered in the backyard. Neighbors, friends, former students, and community volunteers filled the garden. Frank, the neighbor who had once driven Thomas to the hospital, raised a glass. "I've known Thomas for many years. I've seen him at his happiest. I've seen him at his loneliest. But today, I see a man whose greatest wealth isn't this beautiful home. It's the family standing beside him." Everyone applauded. Thomas smiled through tears. That evening, as the guests departed, Daniel handed his father a small wooden box. Inside was an old black and white photograph that had been carefully restored. It showed Thomas and Margaret on the day they bought their first home. On the back, Daniel had engraved a simple message. "Thank you for never giving up on us." Thomas held the photograph against his chest. "This," he whispered, "is worth more than anything money could ever buy." Many years later, when Thomas peacefully passed away in his sleep, his children honored every wish in his letter. The scholarships funded hundreds of students. The Children's Hospital received a generous donation in Margaret's name. Community programs continued helping families for decades. Daniel and Emily inherited not just a portion of their father's estate, but something far greater. His values, his compassion, his forgiveness, and every Sunday, no matter how busy life became, the family still gathered around the same dining table. Not because they had to, because they understood what Thomas had spent a lifetime trying to teach them. Love delayed can become regret. Love shared today becomes a legacy. Nearly 2 years passed after the day Daniel and Emily stood outside the gates, unable to enter the home they had once believed would always belong to them. Looking back, Daniel often said that the closed gate had not kept him away from his father. It had forced him to confront the distance he had created long before. Thomas never mentioned that day again. He didn't need to. His children remembered it every time they drove through the front entrance. Not because of the security guards. Because of the lesson. One Saturday morning, Thomas received a phone call from Frank. "Coffee." Thomas laughed. "You never stop asking, and you've never stopped saying yes." An hour later, the two old friends sat at their favorite cafe. Frank smiled. "You know, you're a different man now." Thomas stirred his coffee. "I finally stopped chasing people." "And what happened?" "They came back." Frank nodded. "Funny how life works." Thomas smiled. "I've learned something." "What's that?" "If you spend your whole life begging people to stay, they'll never understand your value. But if you respect yourself, they begin respecting you too." That afternoon, Noah asked his grandfather to help him build a birdhouse for a school project. Thomas happily agreed. The garage, once silent and forgotten, became a workshop again. Wood shavings covered the floor. The smell of fresh pine filled the air. Noah accidentally hammered his thumb. Ouch. Thomas laughed softly. I did the same thing when your father was your age. Daniel smiled. And Grandpa told me the same thing you're telling Noah. What? Mistakes are proof you're learning. Thomas looked at his grandson. Exactly. 3 generations stood together, building something with their own hands. Thomas realized that this, not money, was the inheritance he had always hoped to leave behind. The birdhouse was finished by sunset. It wasn't perfect. One side leaned slightly, and a little paint had spilled across the roof. Noah frowned. I'm sorry, Grandpa, I messed it up. Thomas smiled and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. No, you didn't. It's not perfect. Neither are people. He turned the birdhouse in his hands. Do you know why I like this? Noah shook his head. Because every mark on it reminds me that someone built it with love. Daniel stood quietly behind them. Those words stayed with him long after the birdhouse was placed on the old oak tree. The following month, Thomas received an invitation from the local university where he had mentored engineering students for years. They wanted to honor him with a Lifetime Community Service Award. When the day arrived, Thomas assumed he would attend alone with Frank. Instead, Daniel, Emily, Rachel, Noah, Lily, and dozens of former students surprised him by filling the front rows. As Thomas walked onto the stage, the audience rose in a standing ovation. The presenter smiled. Mr. Carter spent nearly 4 decades building bridges. He paused, but his greatest achievement wasn't made of steel or concrete. It was the lives he strengthened through kindness, integrity, and generosity. The applause lasted nearly a minute. Thomas accepted the plaque, then stepped to the microphone. I've spent my life believing success was measured by what we built. He looked toward his children. I was wrong. The greatest things we build are relationships. They require patience. They require forgiveness. And sometimes, they require a second chance. Daniel lowered his head. Emily quietly wiped away tears. Everyone in the room applauded again. After the ceremony, Daniel approached his father. Dad. Thomas smiled. Yes, I used to think inheritance meant receiving something after someone was gone. Thomas listened. Now I understand. The real inheritance is learning from the person while they're still here. Thomas embraced his son. That's the lesson I hoped you'd learn. As they walked toward the parking lot together, Thomas glanced at the sunset and thought of Margaret. He smiled softly. We did it, he whispered. Not because the family had become perfect, but because they had chosen each other again. Winter arrived earlier than expected. A light blanket of snow covered the neighborhood, transforming Thomas Carter's garden into a peaceful sea of white. He stood by the living room window with a cup of coffee, watching snowflakes drift onto the roses Margaret had planted years before. For the first time since her passing, the house didn't feel empty during winter. It felt alive. Children's laughter echoed upstairs. Christmas music floated through the hallways. The smell of freshly baked cookies filled every room. Thomas smiled to himself. This is exactly what Margaret always dreamed of. 3 days before Christmas, Daniel arrived carrying several large boxes. Dad, where do you want these decorations? Thomas looked surprised. You remembered where I keep them. Daniel laughed. I helped Mom pack them away every January. I'd forgotten. So had I. Together they climbed into the attic. Dust covered the old wooden boxes. Inside were decades of memories. Handmade ornaments from elementary school. Emily's first Christmas stocking. Family photographs. A small ceramic angel Margaret had bought during their first year of marriage. Daniel carefully picked it up. I broke one of its wings when I was 10. Thomas smiled. And your mother glued it back together. Daniel looked at the tiny crack. You can still see it. Thomas nodded. Some things become more beautiful after they've been repaired. Daniel looked at his father. He knew those words weren't just about the ornament. Meanwhile, downstairs, Emily found Margaret's old cookbook once again. Lily stood beside her. Aunt Emily, can you teach me Grandma's apple pie? Emily smiled. I think Grandma would like that. The kitchen soon became a joyful mess. Flour covered the counter. Sugar spilled across the table. Lily laughed every time she made another mistake. Thomas walked in and laughed. Your grandmother always said the kitchen wasn't supposed to stay clean while making memories. Everyone laughed. For a brief moment, it felt as though Margaret herself was smiling from somewhere nearby. That evening, after dinner, Noah walked over to his grandfather. Grandpa, yes, our teacher asked us to write about our hero. Thomas smiled. Who did you choose? You. Thomas blinked in surprise. Me. Noah nodded. My friends picked athletes and movie stars. But Dad says heroes are people who never stop loving their family. I think that's you. Thomas felt tears welling in his eyes. He hugged his grandson tightly. Thank you. Across the room, Daniel quietly wiped his own eyes. Years earlier, he had almost allowed his children to grow up without truly knowing their grandfather. Now he couldn't imagine life any other way. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Thomas stepped outside onto the porch. Snow continued falling softly. He looked toward the stars. I miss you every day, Margaret. A gentle breeze brushed across his face. He smiled. But I'm not lonely anymore. He looked through the living room window. His children were laughing together while cleaning up after dinner. His grandchildren were asleep upstairs. The old house glowed with warmth. Thomas whispered, "You were right, love can find its way back." As he stood there in the quiet winter night, he realized something he had never fully understood before. A house is built with wood, stone, and years of hard work. But a home is rebuilt with forgiveness. Spring returned once again, bringing new life to the old Carter home. The roses Margaret had planted bloomed brighter than ever. Thomas smiled each morning as he watered them, remembering how she used to say, "Flowers bloom where they're cared for." He finally understood. People did too. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel invited his father to speak at Noah's school for Career Day. "Dad," Daniel said, "the students would love to hear your story." Thomas laughed. "I retired years ago. They don't need to hear about engineering," Daniel replied. "They need to hear about perseverance." The school auditorium was filled with children, parents, and teachers. Thomas stepped to the podium. Instead of talking about bridges and buildings, he spoke about family. "When I was young," he began, "I believed success meant earning more every year. The room became quiet. As I grew older, I learned something much more important. The people who love you don't need your money as much as they need your time." Several parents looked at one another. Thomas continued, "If someone you love calls today, answer the phone. If your parents are waiting for a visit, don't wait until next month. The greatest regrets usually begin with the words, 'I'll do it later.'" The audience rose in applause. Daniel sat in the front row, unable to hold back his tears. He knew every word was true because he had once been the son who kept saying, "Later." Months later, Thomas celebrated his 81st birthday. This year was different from the lonely birthday he had spent years earlier with a single candle and an unanswered phone. The dining room was full. Neighbors, friends, former students, children, grandchildren. Even Frank joked that there weren't enough chairs. After dinner, Emily stood and gently tapped her glass. "I'd like to say something." The room became silent. "There was a time when my brother and I believed success meant having busy lives." She looked toward Thomas. "We forgot that the man who gave us everything never asked for money in return. He only wanted our time." She paused to steady her voice. "Dad, thank you for giving us another chance after we didn't deserve one." Everyone applauded. Thomas simply smiled. "The best gift you've given me isn't today. It's every ordinary Sunday we've spent together since." Later that evening, Noah walked into the study and looked around. "Grandpa, why do you keep all these old photographs?" Thomas handed him one. "Because photographs remind us where we've been." Noah asked, "And what reminds us where we're going?" Thomas pointed toward the living room, where the family was laughing together. A few weeks later, attorney Michael Reynolds made one final visit. He carried the updated trust documents. "Everything is exactly as you requested," he said. Thomas signed the final page. The scholarships remained. The donations to children's hospitals remained. The charitable gifts Margaret had dreamed of remained. Michael smiled. "You never changed the trust." Thomas shook his head. "No, because the trust was never a punishment. It was a lesson, and I believe they learned it." As the years passed, the Carter family created a new tradition. Every Sunday, no matter how busy life became, they gathered around the same dining table. Phones stayed in another room. Televisions remained off. For 2 hours, nothing mattered except conversation, laughter, and being together. Neighbors began calling it the Carter Sundays. To everyone else, it was just a weekly family meal. To Thomas, it was proof that broken relationships could heal. When people chose humility over pride. One quiet evening, Thomas sat alone on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. He wasn't sad. He wasn't waiting for anyone. Inside, he could hear Noah teaching Lily how to play chess while Daniel and Emily argued, playfully, over who made the better apple pie. Thomas laughed softly. Some arguments were worth having. He looked toward the garden and whispered, "Margaret." They came home. A gentle breeze rustled the roses. Thomas closed his eyes. His life had taught him one final truth. Money can buy comfort, success can earn respect, but only love, forgiveness, and time can build a family that lasts. And that was the greatest inheritance anyone could ever leave behind.